First of all, it's a big honor to be here and to be able to present our book before this audience and in this wonderful historic setting on the Russian House, which features many times in our book, with Maisky and Gusev and your predecessors and ambassador. So I'm very thankful for this invitation and this opportunity. And I'm also thankful to David Reynolds, who joined us in this special case. Well, frankly speaking, my first initial reaction, instinctive reaction, before this audience is to sit back, listen and learn. But since I'm supposed to say something, let me briefly explain how this book came about and what we wanted to achieve. It's all started with the image of Franklin Roosevelt's editing his letter to Stalin, which I ran into at Roosevelt Presidential Library in Hyde Park many years ago. Then in the Stalin's archive, I saw Stalin's editing of his letter to Roosevelt. And then I just began to think about doing research on Stalin-Roosevelt correspondence. Soon it became clear that there was a third indispensable man to this relations, and that was, of course, Churchill. And when I first plunged into the British archives, I was struck by the wealth of material on Stalin-Churchill connection. That's how the idea came to my mind, and the rest was easy. I wrote a proposal, I submitted it to our president, not Putin, the president of our school, Torkunov, who then sent it all upstairs to Foreign Minister Lavrov, and we got blessings from a couple of other high officials in Russia, which helped to open some archival doors, especially the Foreign Ministry Archive and the Presidential Archive. Then a grant from Ruski Mir Foundation, supplemented by a small grant from Churchill College at Cambridge and British Academy, thanks to David Reynolds and Alan Packwood, who is not here today, fortunately. We were able, using those funds, we were able to work at here at Kew Garden, the National Archives, at Churchill Archive at Cambridge, and then went to the States to have more stuff from FDR Library and the National Archives at College Park. So all in all, we assembled about 5,000 archival documents, which became a database for our project. I'm saying we because I have this young co-author. He's not a professor yet, but I'm sure he will be.
It's good.
He will be one. He'll join me later in the process, and he was very helpful. He's my legal co-author. So the concept, we began to write about 4 years ago. The concept was fairly simple. First, to examine how those messages were actually written. Because, of course, neither Stalin nor Churchill nor Roosevelt were principal, were doing the actual writing. They intervened, they played a role, but there were other people involved in the process. So we wanted to show the technology, so to speak, of how those messages were really composed. Second, to see how those messages were received by the recipients. What was the reaction, and what the other side, the sender, knew about the recipient's response, and how this information affected their future relationship. And in this sense, the ambassador's reports were very important. Finally, and most importantly, we wanted to put this correspondence into general political, military, diplomatic context of the global war. Because the correspondence itself, first of all, it has been around for many years. It's very well known. But it's just a tip of a huge iceberg of the Allied diplomacy during the war. And it has to be explained. It has to be interpreted in the light of new sources from all the three sides, and in the light of what international history has learned about this whole field during this almost 60 years since the first edition of Correspondence came. This is an orthodox genre, which we call a documentary investigation. but it has some precedents. And two models of inspiration and models to follow were Warren Kimball's seminal edition of Roosevelt-Churchill correspondence, which came in mid-80s, and David Reynolds' brilliant study of how Churchill wrote his memoirs, his Second World War. So we combined different approaches from both authors. Commentary a la Kimball, and from David we took David's way of checking written text against reality that was supposed to describe. And there were some differences between the written version and the reality in many cases. So we had this kind of a stereoscopic view of what took place in all three capitals. And thus we were able to compare the official correspondence with the big three with their real motives and perceptions at that time. Because Churchill would be writing one thing to Stalin, and he would say almost opposite thing to his surrounding, to his circle, which would show his real mood at the time. And we were comparing those two dimensions. So the whole project took about 5 years of hard, painstaking work. There were some difficult knots to untangle, like dating of the messages. It's a problem because in British case and an American case, there were no systematic way of registering Stalin's messages. Whereas in Moscow it was very strict. It's easy to trace all the dates. But the problem with the Russian edition was that 52nd edition, that all the dates were Stalin-centered. In other words, the Roosevelt and Churchill messages were dated by the date they arrived in Moscow, not by the dates they were written actually in Washington or in London, which is not fair, we thought. So we offered this new system of dating, which would date Roosevelt and Churchill messages by the date they were actually written. There were other problems like translation, because of course Stalin didn't read English, so messages had to be translated, and it was done on a hurried way, almost on the knee, so to speak, and sometimes there were mistakes in translation, which could even slightly distort the meaning, and they were grammatical and other mistakes, so we had to pay attention to this problem too. They were paraphrasing, there was also an interesting problem of identifying handwriting, especially in Stalin's case, because his assistant, Paskrebyshev, had a very similar handwriting to Stalin's. Well, at the last moment we were able to avoid the mistake of identifying allegedly Stalin message as written actually by Paskrebyshev. Stalin was obviously dictating the message to him. So those
reproduced in the book.
Yeah. So those were the, so to speak, the technical problems we had to handle. But they are also important and interesting for professional historians to deal with. So it was a hard and time-consuming effort, but it was also a labor of love. I never in my life engaged in a more interesting project, because deciphering and reconstructing the meaning of each message, and each message has a small story behind it, was very rewarding and exciting work. As Alexander Pushkin, our great poet, said once, there is nothing more engaging than following thoughts of great men. So we're not able to estimate personal contributions by Stalin, Churchill, and Roosevelt to this correspondence, and thus we're able to see more clearly what were driving them, what were their real thoughts and way of thinking. In this immersion process, the big three, Stalin, Roosevelt, and Churchill, became so much alive, at least in my case, that they began to visit me during night dreams. Not a very comfortable presence in case of Stalin, I must say, but still, it was almost an obsession. Thanks to Ivan Maisky diary, which of course Gabriel Gorodetzky is making great work on, in his 3 volumes of the British edition, English edition, which is about to come out, and other recently disclosed diplomatic traffic that was done exclusively for our project with the Foreign Minister permission, where I not know much more about how this interaction developed, how this astute Stalin-Maisky, fascinating tandem of 2, especially in the beginning of the war, how they cooperated with each other, how Stalin followed Maisky's advice, sometimes almost to their battle. And that was also new, at least to me and some other people. More specific, we know more about ambassadors' role in this process, because they were the strong ambassadors like Maisky, Carr, or Harman, Cripps too, to a small extent. They were not just the agents, transmissions belts, they were important intermediaries who sometimes affected the content of the correspondence, gave their advice, recommendations, and guided their bosses in this process. More specifically, there is in our book, there is an interesting new evidence on the Polish problem, how it used to be called then, as it was seen by the Soviet side, on exchange of military and intelligence information, on Lend-Lease supplies, and other issues of the Allied diplomacy. There is also new light shed on such episodes as Roosevelt's stay on Soviet territory during the Tehran conference, the Burma crossword incident, the V-Day announcement, how it came about that there were 2 V-Days, one in Moscow and the other in London and Washington, and there is an interesting story behind the scenes. Preparations for Potsdam conferences, for Potsdam conference, and many other specific episodes of our relations during the war came out in some richer, new light. They may not be huge sensations in our book, but there are many, I would say hundreds, new, fresh details illuminating this famous and well-researched relationship. Especially interesting in this audience, perhaps more so, is Stalin-Churchill connection, in which the cold-blooded Machiavellian from the Caucasus faced emotional and impulsive Britain. One of my favorite stories, fully revealed for the first time in the book, is how Churchill refused to officially accept Stalin's fairly rough message of October 43 about the British personnel in the North. Stalin rejected flatly Churchill's plea for enhancing his contingent. We of course know this episode from Churchill's Second World War, which he described in full. And now we have, for the first time in the book, we have Ambassador Gusev's report, his cable, and what happened, what transpired during that conversation. And it's not so much different in substance from Churchill's account, but there is one key difference, and let me quote. I can't abstain from that. At first sight, cabled Gusev in his cable, Churchill's teary eyes made me suspect that he was drunk. In the course of the conversation, this impression was confirmed, since he smelled wine. He was drunk indeed. End of the citation. Well, that sounds plausible because it was at 3 o'clock after lunchtime, sometimes accompanied with whiskey in Churchill's case. But we also know, even in Gusev's own rendering of the story, that Churchill was quite articulate. He was quite concentrated and well informed. And we also know that after seeing Gusev off, he chaired a War Cabinet meeting, which fully approved this démarche of refusing. So it's more likely it was our guess, it's more likely that Gusev was exaggerating the degree of Churchill's intoxication in order to defend himself in Stalin's eyes. Because after all, he was not supposed to cooperate in this insulting Churchill's action. But at the same time, if Churchill was drunk, he couldn't fight the drunk prime minister twice his age. So that was how Gusev came out of this rather unpleasant and difficult episode. And that was his first encounter with Churchill. So who said that diplomatic history should be dull? More seriously, there are also some larger themes which come out of this project. Following ups and downs of this triangle relationship almost day by day, I was greatly impressed by the ability of those three men to get out of the most difficult situations they occasionally stumbled into, and to compromise on a very tough and seemingly incompatible positions. Even when they could not agree, they muddled through, despite huge differences in personalities and policies. There's no political message or purpose behind this book. We didn't want to redistribute blame or fame, and tried hard to abstain from moral judgments. It was an exercise in developing empathy for all three sides, in trying to understand what moved each of the big three. I know it may sound corny, but we simply sought to provide an honest, objective analysis of why the leaders of the Grand Alliance interacted the way they did. The analysis which go beyond standard Cold War interpretations by both sides. It's not up to us to judge how we succeeded in this enterprise, but we hope that our book may contribute in a small way to a better understanding of our common past. After all, the unique Allied experience of the World War II remains, despite its known problems and contradictions, remains the most positive legacy of our relations during the 20th century. Who knows where we would have been without it. And on a personal note, this is the 22nd of June, Barbarossa Day, which is in Russia is known as Day of Memory and Sorrow. Churchill used to say that during the war, about 25, and correct me if I'm wrong, 25 million soldiers marched according to our orders all over the globe. Well, among those millions, there were 5 close kins of mine, my father and 4 uncles, who were at the Eastern Front. And 2 of them never came back. So on this day, I can't help recalling them and all those who perished in the war of our allies. And perhaps we should have been dedicating this book to them. And finally, a few words about how the book is being received in Russia, which may be of interest here. It may be too early to tell, but the first reaction has been very positive. There was some publicity prior and soon after the publication. I gave an interview to our magazine, Ogonyok, which is still pretty popular, about 70,000 is in circulation. Then I gave an hour radio interview about the book. But most importantly, there was a big presentation. There was a big book party organized by the Foreign Ministry at the historic Spiridonov House, which housed, of course, hosted the big Allied conference during the war, beginning with 41 mission of Bibelbrod Herman. And Foreign Minister Lavrov presided over the proceedings, and there were Allied ambassadors, both British and American, and Chinese. So the turnout was very high, which of course we attribute not so much to ourselves as authors, but rather to Lavrov's presence. But anyway, it was a very good event which was followed and which was reported on the evening TV programs of two large networks in Russia. And I don't recall in my recent memory any other case where publication of a book became evening news event. After that, the first print has been sold out pretty quickly, and some more ignorant journalists even began to say that there is a new edition of secret correspondence Stalin-Churchill and Roosevelt. But it also helped with the sales. So the second edition, or second print, is already coming out by the next fall. It's hard to predict the future, of course, especially dealing with the books in this day and age. But we sincerely hope that the book will still be around a few years from now, and maybe of some use both to professional historians and to general public. Thank you again for your attention.